excited about our trip this weekend so that they can go back and watch and learn. But again, Miss Helen, thank you for taking your time this afternoon to talk with us. And again, just kind of get us excited and prep the learning before we venture down that way this weekend. So, Miss Helen, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, I am very glad to be able to join you this afternoon. I'm even more excited that you are coming to see us in person. And so I will just introduce myself. We'll introduce the building. We'll talk a little bit about our exhibits and programs, and just know that we are always available to answer questions, to steer you towards additional resources if you end up deciding to try and incorporate some of what you've learned in your classrooms. We have a lot of resources on our website. I'll be talking a little bit about that at the end. And the most important thing for Wendy to share will be my email. It's pretty straightforward. It is my name, helen.sanders@nashville.gov. So you should definitely feel free to email me here at the Parthenon with additional questions anytime. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and let's do this and this. That will look just a little better. There we go. Can you all see that? I don't know why it wants me to leave the meeting.
That looks great, Miss Helen.
Okay. So here we go. Here is the Parthenon on a beautiful day. And you will soon see this and know that we are in a park. We are part of Nashville's Metropolitan Parks system. And therefore we are part of Nashville's city government. We are supported by a nonprofit called the Centennial Park Conservancy. And they do a tremendous amount to support activities in the park, our exhibits, and our programming. Here's a little bit about me. I have been in this particular role at the Parthenon for about 2 years. But I've been connected with the Parthenon for much, much longer than that, going back about 15 plus years on and off. I came into this position because I'm an archaeologist. I'm a museum educator. I'm really at heart a teacher. I have been a college teacher and taught college classes. And I also have professional experience as a volunteer coordinator. I use all of these skills in my current role. So what you see is me leading a group of 6th graders up the steps as part of our special STEAM expeditions. Those are specially designed field trips that we do through our Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools STEAM program. We welcome about 2,000 6th graders from 18 schools in January and February, and we have just completed another successful STEAM season. And then we do a lot of gallery programming. It can be informal gallery learning with talks in our galleries. And a lot of this is done by our docents, our volunteer docents. And so my role is really to help train the docents and give them the skills they need to lead many of our field trips and programs. This is me. This is proof that once upon a time I really was a field archaeologist. And I got a PhD and an MA from the University of Michigan in classical art and archaeology. I had field work experience in Tunisia and Greece. So you see me in a trench taking notes in Tunisia. And when I moved to Nashville about 20 years ago, the one thing I knew about Nashville was there's a Parthenon there. And it seems to be a museum, and museums always need volunteers. So I started as a volunteer leading tours. I've had other museum work experiences, and I worked for many years at Nashville Public Library. And so I began my career working at the Smithsonian. I've had other experiences, but really when I moved to Nashville for other reasons, I just knew that I could make a contribution through the Parthenon by sharing what I know, because it's so extraordinary that we have this building here in Nashville. All right. I am actually wondering if anyone in the group has traveled to Greece. I don't know if we could use the chat, or I wonder if, I'm just curious if anyone has traveled to Greece. It'd be interesting to know that. Anyway, as a reminder, I was in an elementary school classroom this morning, so I always like to say, you know, it's a long way to Greece. And if we were to get on an airplane and go there, this is what more or less what we would see. And the ancient Parthenon is on a rocky hill called the Acropolis. And we are just very fortunate that we don't have to travel all the way to Greece. We can explore some of this history and art right here in Nashville. So one distinction we like to make is here in Nashville, we are a museum of art and history. We are a full-scale replica. That means we recreate at scale in the same size and with the same architectural elements, the entire ancient Parthenon. And this is what you see when you go to Greece, because of course the ancient Parthenon is now about 2,400 years old. And so we can, in a sense, time travel, recreate a kind of immersive experience that allows us to talk about ancient art and ancient history in a way that isn't possible in other places. So it's always excellent to ask this question: why is there a Parthenon in Nashville? The answer to that question is because in 1897, there was an event, a fair called the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. It was held to celebrate 100 years of Tennessee being a state, Tennessee being part of the United States. And at that time, Nashville's nickname was the Athens of the South. We think that this nickname was really because people took pride in the number of universities, the culture and learning in Nashville. It may also have been a reference to the state capitol, which uses a Greek building rather than a Roman dome and references Greek democracy. However this name arose, it already existed before the exposition took place. So the organizers of the exposition made a version of the Parthenon as the central emblem for this 6-month fair. And you're seeing a promotional poster that shows us that there were many buildings set up in what is now Centennial Park. The Parthenon was just one among many. It was not even the biggest building. There were a lot of exhibits, a lot of displays. It celebrated, it was intended to celebrate progress, technology. It occurred at a time of economic depression. The organizers were trying to generate tourism for Nashville. Many of the buildings were torn down. The Parthenon was left standing. Almost all these buildings were intended to be temporary. And they were built mainly out of plaster with some wood and brick. So this Parthenon did not hold up very well. Here's a view, again, of the 1897 Parthenon. It served as an art gallery, so it was hung floor to ceiling with paintings, but it did not attempt to look like the ancient building on the inside. And this was a giant statue of Athena that stood outside, actually made by an artist named Enid Yandell, a woman sculptor who was originally from Kentucky. So that's the exposition Parthenon. but it was replaced and rebuilt, incorporating a few elements in the foundations, but really essentially rebuilt in concrete in the 1920s. That's the building that you will see when you come visit us in a few days. So we're really talking about three Parthenons. When we talk about Nashville and the Nashville Parthenon, we're talking about a building made out of concrete in the 1920s. We're talking about the first Parthenon in Nashville for the exposition, made in 1897, mainly plaster, wood, and brick. And we're talking about how they replicate and bring to us versions of the ancient Greek building from the classical period from 447 to 432 BCE, made out of marble. So really three Parthenons. One of the most important features now inside our current building, the 1920s Parthenon, is a recreation of the enormous Athena statue. This was added in the 1980s. So this space stood mostly empty. Although they wished they could have built an Athena in the 1920s, they were not able to do that. The project was taken up again in the 1980s, and a local sculptor named Helen he won a competition. He got the commission to recreate a version of the Athena. And he won this competition because he said he would work with archaeologists to recreate it as accurately as possible. And most of this work occurred between 1982 and 1990. It stood mostly white, but they added gold leaf in 2002, in the summer of 2002, because we know the ancient sculpture was built out of wood covered with gold and ivory. I love this picture because Alan's pretty tall. He's taller than I am. And so if he's almost 6 feet tall and the statue is almost 42 feet tall, it would really take 7 Allens stacked one on top of the other to equal the height of the sculpture. We do know that the ancient sculpture filled the entire space. It was enormous. And this is something that you can experience better when you're here in person than looking at a small square over Zoom. But still, I love this picture because it does give us some sense of the scale. Another way to understand the scale of the sculpture and how big it is by looking at the Nike figure. Now, this is a winged female figure held in Athena's hand. It might look a little like an angel to you or your students. We teach that this is a figure of a Nike, which means victory in Greek. Now, of course, the first thing we all think about is sneakers, right? The sneaker company has borrowed the word Nike because it means victory. They want you to think you're going to be victorious in sports if you buy their stuff. To the Greeks, the idea of victory was represented as a winged female figure. And in many ways, this represents Athena bringing victory to the Athenians. So the statue and the ancient Greek Parthenon were built soon after the Athenians worked with the Spartans to defeat the Persians, soon after the Persian Wars. And so the Athenians were really trying to celebrate these military victories and show everyone how important they were. That's the importance of the Nike. All right. This pair of photos shows you when the Athena was first completed. It stood mostly white with just a little bit of gold leaf. The material is a mixture of gypsum, cement, and fiberglass. And in 2002, they did add real gold, paper thin, gold leaf, like what you add to a picture frame when you're gilding it. And it was simply glued on. They put up more scaffolding, they glued it on in about 3 to 4 months, and added some paint. And so it's really now colorful the way the ancient statue would have been colorful. This shows you a few other reconstructions and some of the sources we have. It's really a great question to say, well, how do we know what that statue looked like? It's an ancient statue that has disappeared. How do we know? Well, it was a very famous sculpture. We have sources from the Roman period, especially because it was very famous in Roman times. Tourists came to see it. We have the Roman author Pausanias, who was essentially writing a guidebook for Roman tourists in Greece, who describes what he saw. And we have some really significant smaller statues of varying sizes. This one is almost, well, it's a little more than 3 feet tall. It's about 1 meter tall, so a little bit more than 3 feet. And this one's actually pretty small, more like 14 inches, but they are incredibly important Roman period marble sculptures that are clearly replicating the famous statue from Athens. This is a different reconstruction, much smaller in scale, that is in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto in Canada. And this for a long time was an important reconstruction, just not at the same scale as ours in Nashville. Let me show you a few pictures of the building going up in the 1920s when they were taking some of the structural elements, but then essentially pouring a new superstructure over and around and above the foundations from 1897. The blueprints had been drawn up by a leading archaeologist, American archaeologist named William Bell Dinsmore. There was a Nashville architecture firm and a Nashville engineering firm who completed the construction in concrete. There were 2 sculptors who worked on this version. George Julian Zolnay made the metapies. Those are the almost square panels above the columns. And Belle Kinney Schultz and her husband Leopold Schultz created the sculptures that went in the pediments, which are the triangular ends of the building. These are models that Belle Kinney Schultz created for the pediments. So she needed to create models before she could create the larger scale concrete versions. We have these on display in our museum. Here's a picture of her in her studio. This is a small model that we have in our museum that was her sort of working model, her suggestion. If she had made a version of the Athena in the 1920s or 30s, it would have looked more like this. And so we have this kind of proposal, this model that was her suggestion for what the Athena should look like. But they weren't able to complete the project then. So what we have are plaster casts and models. These plaster casts were brought from England. They were taken directly from the ancient marble sculptures that are now in the British Museum. And she studied them. So in a way, it was like studying pieces of the puzzle, right? They represent what is left after a lot of damage and wear and tear. She, based on the scholarship of the time, was basically filling in the pieces of the puzzle that were missing and making an interpretation. And this is her 1/3 scale model. You will, those of you coming here over the weekend, you will see these on display in what we call the treasury room, the smaller of the 2 rooms upstairs on the upper level of our museum. All right. it's always useful just to review a little bit of architecture. When you're looking at the facade of a Greek building, I do like to divide it in shapes. I think this is especially useful with students. We've just done a lot of field trips with sixth graders. I like to have the sixth graders look at this building and take apart the shape. So we start with the triangle on top, and that is called a pediment, and it's filled with sculptures that tell stories from Greek myth. Then we have a zone of the building that is between the pediment and the columns, and that is called the entablature. And the part that's really important to focus on is the metope, the squarish panel. They're almost square, they're slightly rectangular. And they're interspersed with these ridged panels. Again, the Greeks filled these spaces with sculptures from Greek myth. So the metopes have stories from Greek myth. And then we are looking at the columns, lines, in a sense, up and down. The Parthenon is what we call a Doric building. It's the Doric style. So it has Doric columns, and the tops of the columns, the capitals, are just a semicircle, a kind of flaring circle, and a square. So not a it looks like a semicircle, but it's like a flaring circle that goes all around, and a square. That's a Doric column. So there are other architectural elements that always go with the Doric columns, and we call it the Doric order, the Doric style. And the easiest way for your students to tell what style they're looking at is to look at the top of the columns. When I'm teaching, probably the biggest word that I want people to remember is the pediment, the triangle. That's a useful word. I like to remind students, we use these words, archaeologists and architects use these words because they're convenient. They help us describe what we're looking at. You don't need to know these words to describe what you're looking at, but if you talk about it a lot, it becomes useful to have a way to talk about it more easily. One thing that we do like to emphasize is that there are actually no straight lines in the Parthenon. They introduced a lot of curves to the building, and you can see these details up close when you visit. So the platform is curved. The columns bulge. They're tapered. They're narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, but they also bulge. And so they actually are at their widest 1/3 of the way up right here. The corner columns got scooted in. They're actually closer to their neighbors than the other columns. And the columns on the building, if you go down the colonnade, these columns lean in at the top towards the walls. So they're not really perpendicular, they are leaning inward. And these are all adjustments and refinements that the Greeks made to the building because they had been building structures out of stone for over 200 years in this style. They had learned to compensate for certain optical illusions. For instance, if they had built the building flat, it might have looked saggy. But they had learned to introduce a curve so that it would look flat from a distance. And you really do have to look closely yourself. Up close, you probably wouldn't notice this from far away if I hadn't told you about that. We also like to emphasize that Greek architecture and Greek sculpture was brightly and vividly colored. When you come to our building and you are in the treasury room, that is a great place to look up at the ceiling and to see that they introduced some red and blue into the concrete It's like dye that was introduced into the concrete, so it's more durable than paint. But that shows us that they knew that there was some color in certain zones of the building. This is an area where we understand much more than we used to. There's active research going on that takes advantage of a lot of scientific techniques. And there are a lot of studies by conservators and scientists of traces of paint, even if they're not visible to our eyes any longer. And so we are learning more and more about all the different colors that were on the Parthenon and other architecture and sculpture. So it's always worthwhile to remember we may see the Parthenon like this today, but when it was first made, it looked more like this. And look at that color. Look at how they added white to make an even more vivid contrast with the zones of color. And notice they were also adding some attachments and some decoration in metal. So some of these figures held spears or swords or other weapons or attributes. Well, those were most likely metal that was added in addition to the paint. Now, briefly, if we talk about ancient Greece and the ancient Acropolis, it's good to think about the Parthenon in its archaeological and architectural context. So the Acropolis was simply a rocky hill in the middle of ancient Athens. It was a sanctuary, and it housed many buildings. And Athena was the most important goddess for the city of Athens, but there were other gods and heroes and goddesses and shrines and sanctuaries and buildings on the Acropolis. And it is all remarkably well preserved, really, when you go to Athens today. I don't think we want to talk too much about the history, but maybe it's useful just to review the historical context for the ancient Parthenon. The Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta, and also Corinth and other important cities, fought a series of battles with the Persians who were trying to invade parts of Greece. And we learn about this from the historian Herodotus, and we know the names and dates of some of the significant battles. The Athenians had a navy, and the Spartans had an army, and together they really drove out the Persians. Then there was a time when Athens was very powerful. They emerged from the Persian Wars very powerful. Pericles was the politician and leader of Athens during this time. The Athenians were at the head of a group of cities, island cities that were well known for their ships and their navies, called the Delian League. So the headquarters were on the island of Delos. And the Athenians basically took money from their allies that was supposed to be used by everybody. And we think that was really the money that they used to rebuild the Acropolis. So it's worth remembering all of this because it allows us to understand that the Parthenon grew out of this particular moment in history, where the Athenians were both thanking Athena in their own minds. They were thanking Athena for helping them secure these important victories. They reference battles in many parts of the Parthenon, but they're also bragging about themselves. They're trying to show off and show how important they were. And they're doing a lot of unusual things in the Parthenon. Then there's a moment where the Athenians will enter into conflict with the Spartans. is called the Peloponnesian Wars, and it's really a series of skirmishes that is sort of long and drawn out over a long period of time. And it ends in the defeat of the Athenians by the Spartans. And this is what we learn about from the historian Thucydides. The Parthenon was built in just 15 years, from 447 to 432 BCE. That includes the sculptural embellishments. When we talk about the sculptures of the Parthenon, we're really talking about three parts of the building that have very significant sculptures that are part of the building. They're architectural sculptures. And we're talking about this Athena Parthenos statue, the cult statue, the very giant, large statue of Athena. And when we talk about the architectural sculptures, we're talking about sculptures of the metopes, those squarish panels, the pediments, and something called the Ionic frieze. And that is a piece of decoration that we do not have in Nashville. So let me just show you. It helps to see the ancient Parthenon, an example of a metope, a piece of this sculptural decoration called the Ionic frieze, a continuous band that seems to be a religious procession in honor of Athena, the pedimental sculptures, and then our recreation of the missing enormous Athena statue. So those we'd consider really the four different sculptural elements of the building. And keep in mind, we are missing one of them in Nashville. Keep in mind, they were brightly colored. So here's just a close-up of some of the metopes. It's interesting to note that on the ancient building, there were 4 different battle scenes on the 4 different sides of the building that had metopes. Our Nashville Parthenon takes scenes from the south side and puts them all the way around, whereas the ancient building had 4 different battle scenes. So there are some differences between our building and the ancient one, mainly in the arrangement of the sculptural decoration. So here's just some drawings and our metopes. Here's a diagram that helps you see where the metopes and the pediment are on the building. And it helps you see where this continuous band of sculpture would have gone over the porches and down the sides. That's what we do not have here in Nashville. Then these are what I've shown you before, which you will see here in our treasury room, the plaster casts, Bell Kinney Schultz's model, and then some of the original sculptures in the British Museum. And then again, our treasury. And a reminder that we have different ways, different reconstructions in color. Of course, one thing that I do want to talk about, I've referenced that some of the sculptures are in England in the British Museum. And it's important to understand that they were taken there by a British Lord Elgin around 1800. So they were taken from Greece to England. They ended up in the British Museum. Lord Elgin was a British diplomat to the Turkish Ottoman Empire. He had some form of permit, but he seems to have exceeded what was really allowed, even by the standards of the time. So it's quite controversial whether he should have taken as many sculptures as he did, even by the standards of the time. Something like this would be less likely to happen now. And it's still a different question. Well, what happens next? So again, we like to tell students, you may read about these ancient sculptures in the newspapers. You may hear them called the Elgin marbles. That's kind of a nickname for the sculptures that ended up in England, even though they came from a Greek building. And the British government and the Greek government are in conversation and in discussion to see what should happen next. And they're in a standoff. The Greek government would like to have the sculptures returned. They have a museum at the base of the Acropolis where they could display them. And there are a lot of discussions amongst very large museums that have collections from all over the world about this issue of repatriation. And I find especially high school level students are really interested in having conversations about this issue. And we can make a nice connection to this idea, to the complexity of these discussions, by talking a little bit about the history of these casts. That's our connection to these larger issues to do with repatriation. And I'm not entirely sure what level of students you're teaching, but I find that this issue resonates, especially with high school students. And again, a reminder, we have a couple different versions of the colors. I'm showing you a book that was published quite a long time ago with some watercolor drawings. This is a modern reconstruction that I showed you previously, associated with the flyover zone, some newer digital recreations of ancient monuments. And this is an experiment in lighting. A company came to Nashville in about 2015 or 16. And for a few nights, they shone special lights on the outside of the building that allowed us to envision it in color without intervening on the building or actually needing to paint it. They just shone special lights. So these are all ways to visualize and think about the different colors of ancient art. I don't know if any of you have been to Centennial Park recently, but you're about to come. And you'll see that we have a monument to the suffragettes in our park, also made by Alan LaQuire. That's a relatively new addition. In addition to our upper level that recreates the Greek building, we have permanent collections. We have a permanent collection of American art called the Cowan Collection. And it's mainly 19th century landscape painting. It includes Winslow Homer, a piece by Thomas Moran. And so we have opportunities to look at paintings and talk a little bit about American art in our collections. We have had an exhibit called The Role of a Replica, which is not currently on view, but will be back on view towards the end of March. And this was really our attempt to talk a little bit more about what we learned from replicas and some of the current trends in scholarship. So you will not see these panels for the most part when you come visit this time, but maybe in future we'll have it back up soon. We do quite a number of programs, especially in conjunction with some of our changing exhibits. Right now in our East Gallery, we have an exhibit of really amazing photographs by an artist named Christy Lee Rogers. She photographs models who are actually swimming underwater. She is suspended above them and she's photographing models who are swimming underwater. And we have organized a series of educational workshops around the theme of the Muses, which is the title of her show. And we have these posted on our website calendar. We do lots and lots of programs. I am doing a kids story time in front of Athena, our Centennial Park partners. The Centennial Park Conservancy sponsors Saturday morning kids programming with craft and story times. We also have a cart that we now call the investigation station, where we invite visitors to come up and talk with our docents, who can engage in one-on-one conversations on different topics. about what we're seeing around us and answer questions. So you see two docents at one of our carts getting ready to introduce people to our, it looks to me like they're getting ready to do the Cowan challenge and talk with visitors, encourage them to look at our landscape paintings in the Cowan collection. We do a lot of in-person and some virtual programming. We have a quarterly book club. We just recently had Glynis Fox, who is an author and illustrator who helped create a graphic history about the end of the Bronze Age. And we have some upcoming book club dates. We also do scholarly lectures, and many of these are virtual. So just know that coming up on March 12th, we have Christopher Beekman, who is a scholar archaeologist who excavates in Western Mexico. He's talking to us about Mesoamerican archaeology. It will be virtual, so you can join by Zoom. We have Bridget Buxton, who is an underwater archaeologist, coming in person in April. And we have Elise Friedland, who is a scholar of Roman art who teaches at George Washington University and has therefore gotten really interested in neoclassical architecture in our capital. And she's going to be giving us a talk about the classical models for lots of those monuments and buildings that we're familiar with in Washington, D.C. That's going to be virtual. So just know that you can always go to our website, which is NashvilleParthenon.com. And two places that will interest you are our calendar, which shows you any upcoming events and includes virtual lectures, and education. We have many resources posted under education, which you are free to use. I might highlight a series of what we call STEAM videos. They were created in conjunction with our special STEAM field trips. And they're short 2 to 3 minute videos that you can string together a couple to show in your classroom if you want. As many or as few, like we have about 16 and they're all about 2 to 3 minutes. You can choose which ones you want. We have some educational resources, a packet that we use with our STEAM field trips, which you would be welcome to use, even if you weren't bringing your classes here. Other educational resources include a packet on which Greek god, how can you tell the Greek gods apart? One about the history of the park and the exposition. So we have all sorts of packets which you can review. We have one on color, polychromy, the many colors of ancient art, which is really good background if you wanted to read your way through the packet before it would give you some ideas for talking with your classes about that. And you, as I mentioned at the beginning, you are always free to email me with questions or to see if I can point you in the direction of other resources that might be helpful to you. We also do virtual field trips. I make virtual presentations to classrooms. We have a form on our website you can submit just to request time, and we will try to schedule you someone on our education staff to talk to your classes. I'm going to stop your screen sharing and come back. And I think we do have time for some questions. Right now, there should be time for some questions.
Helen, I've got a couple of questions about some of the sculptures.
Mhm.
Did any of the sculptures that were kind of found in the Parthenon influence Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci? Kind of like that
Yeah.
birth of the Renaissance? Because I know I studied some of it in college, and there was like a few sculptures, not the one that did Myron, but there was one a little bit later from the Hellenistic period. that kind of
Yeah.
really influenced Michelangelo, kind of the body proportions and everything. I don't know
Yes.
if you know much about that area.
Yeah. Um, it's really interesting. So we do know that the Renaissance artists, Leonardo, Michelangelo, they were influenced by classical models, by both Greek and Roman sculptures. Um, and they were influenced by sculptures from a lot of different periods, including specifically the Hellenistic period, which you mentioned, which is after the Parthenon,
Uh,
and the Roman period. But it's fair to say generally classical art. So the kinds of art generally that influence them, we can see some of this, I would say, especially in the pediment sculptures. So if you wanted to make comparisons with your classes, you could generally talk about how these classical sculptures represented by the Parthenon sculptures are the kind of thing that was influencing them. Because in the classical period, the Greek sculptures were really interested in drawing on nature. They were kind of doing two interesting things. They were really interested in naturalism and trying to make the human body as naturalistic as possible. They're showing a lot of movement, of form. It's a fact that in Greek art, the male gods and heroes are shown nude or semi-nude because that's part of how the Greeks are showing them to be idealized and heroic. So they're kind of doing two things at the same time. They're talking about the ideal of the human body, but also drawing directly on nature to try and make that naturalistic. So those trends in classical art are of great interest to the Renaissance artists.
Now, is Myron part of that group, or is he kind of like before the classical period, like the disc thrower?
Oh, so the Discobolus is part of the classical period.
Okay.
Yes.
Now,
There,
what about Winged Victory, like the one that's in the Louvre in Paris?
yes, the victory of Samothrace in the
Yeah.
Louvre is from the Hellenistic period.
Okay, that's how I've seen that one in person,
Mhm.
and that's just amazing because it actually has its own spot, in the museum, and it's
Yes.
pretty incredible. So
They have it positioned, or it's been a long time since I've been there, but they had it positioned at the top of a staircase
yep,
for
yep.
years. That just makes it all
That's
the more
probably
impressive.
yeah.
It's from a sanctuary in Samothrace, is an island up near Turkey, and it's from the Hellenistic period. So it's from a later period when they're really doing dramatic things with the drapery.
Yes.
And they've become interested in like almost hyper realism, where they're just like the drapery just goes around in circles and
Uh,
swirls, and
I
is
mean,
in some ways kind of exaggerated. Um, but generally, uh, the Renaissance artists were drawing from all these different periods.
but to be able to sculpt like that during that
Mhm.
time with the tools that they have, it's just, it kind of blows my mind because my background is in fine art. And then I went on to be an art education major. So,
Uh-huh.
I mean, trying to use those tools in the studio, and it's just like, okay, I'm done. Even drawing that is hard. Yeah.
I think that one point that's really important um, for students to understand is that these monuments were made by many artisans, many laborers. Um, it wasn't just one famous artist. So we know the names of a few artists who were the really famous ones. Phidias, for example, but we view him more as the kind of project manager or the designer, right? And scholars who study the sculptures on the Parthenon can tell that there are different, what they call hands at work. So they can identify different traits in the details that give away different artists working. Everyone has their own kind of way to carve a nose or a finger. And they can identify that there are different styles and different hands at work. So we know that these were made by many, many, many skilled sculptors. It took a team of sculptors to carve all of these.
Couple of questions about the Nashville place. How many
Mhm.
Winslow Homers do you all have?
We have a
Like,
single Winslow Homer.
oh, okay.
You glimpsed it in the galleries. It's called Rab and the Girls. Rab is a dog and two young
Okay.
women. It's a very unconventional Winslow Homer. If you know Winslow Homer's art, you're probably thinking of a seascape off
Right.
the rocky coast of Maine. This is not that. This is a very unconventional Winslow Homer from a time when he was really making a transition from being an illustrator for magazines to the kind of art that he developed later in his career.
Now, what other American artists do you all have in your museum in Nashville?
Um, we have some Hudson River School painters, Albert
Okay.
Bierstadt,
Oh,
Frederick Edwin Church, Thomas Moran,
okay.
and others.
I wish I would have went on the trip now.
Okay, well,
I'm
some
not
other time,
going.
come on down. It's part of our permanent collection, so
Okay.
they're almost always on view.
Now, I saw the Beardstadt painting of Yellowstone Park that was in Knoxville about 15, 20 years ago, and it's like 10 foot by 16 foot. It's massive. It's like you're looking out a big plated glass window into this park. It's pretty crazy. So that's like
Helen,
the first time I saw that.
there are a couple of other questions in the chat. Like I know Sarah has one that said, is there a cost for your virtual field trips? That her English class just finished reading the Odyssey.
There is no cost to our virtual field trips. I will beam into your classroom for free. It's just a question of scheduling. My calendar gets kind of full. I have some other staff who support me with this. But if you make a request and we leave enough time, I will try to put you on my calendar.
Woohoo! Did everyone hear that? Another free resource. Woohoo! And then I know Robin has a question as well.
Right?
Excuse me. I teach elementary, so I have looked up information to tell the students, that in Greek times these buildings were painted. But I've seen a little bit of, I'm not sure which information is correct. Did the Renaissance time period know they were painted and they just chose not to paint when they recreated? Or have we for sure found all of that information out now?
I think there's no one single answer to that. So I think that a lot of times the paint had faded and they may not have been aware. Other times, maybe it just didn't make sense to them. They saw the color. There are certain times in period later on, I think especially in the 19th century, where it's a little more problematic, where people have just gotten accustomed to seeing these as plain, and they're not paying attention to the color. But in the Renaissance period, I suspect that they were less aware of that. I don't think there's a single answer to that question. And I do think that right now we are in a time when we have available certain kinds of scientific techniques that really, they are essentially shining ultraviolet light or taking different versions of X-rays of the sculpture. So these are scientific techniques that are available to us that help us understand color, even when it's not visible to our eyes. And that allows us a little more systematic exploration of the colors than what was possible, because even in like some of the watercolor drawings that I showed you from 100 years ago, someone paying close attention who was documenting, oh, there's a little bit of color, might only have known there was a little bit of red and blue, but wouldn't have, maybe some of the other colors more easily faded. So I think we do have access to scientific techniques now that help create a fuller picture than what was possible before.
Thank you.
Ty, do you want to ask your question there? I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry.
I just was wondering, oh, I don't know what happened to my video. Did you do you have any resources in terms of like storytelling for the pediment on the the triangle on the top? Like I'm interested in knowing those stories, when I go and visit.
Yes. So we tell the stories. The east pediment is the birth of Athena from the head of her father Zeus. The west pediment is the contest between Athena and Poseidon to see who would become the patron of the city of Athens. On the base of the Athena statue is a little bit of the Pandora story. It's focused on Pandora standing next to Hephaestus. There's the story of the Greeks and centaurs, the Greek heroes fighting giants, the Greek heroes fighting Amazons. And on the chest of Athena is the head of Medusa. So we can talk about the story of Perseus and Medusa. And we can tell different versions of these stories. I think you'll find these different stories described on our website. And I like to just, if I can make students understand that these were stories that got told over and over in different ways, and that creating sculptures and drawing are ways of telling stories, and that the stories got told out loud before they were written down. If I can make students understand this is about storytelling and stories happen in different versions, I think that's a really big main idea, especially for younger students to absorb, that because so many times they are so excited by, well, the middle schoolers love Percy Jackson, or they get so excited by the Greek myths, they lock in on very specific versions that they know and they've seen. And if you're teaching younger kids, it's amazing what they retain. They know details that I have forgotten. And so what I like to extract, anytime you're in that situation, what I like to extract is, isn't that great that you know versions of these stories and I told you something different, or I had less time, so I told you something shorter. Isn't it great that we tell these stories in different ways? Because that's what the Greeks were doing. The Greeks were telling them over and over. And I like to kind of sometimes make the point, not everyone could read. So people told stories, people made the sculptures as a way to tell stories. And just to bring it to that kind of storytelling point and have extract a bigger idea, something I think is genuinely valuable when you're teaching the myths.
I think we have one more question in the chat, and it was from Valerie. And she said she's just curious what you studied in college to become an archaeologist and what made you decide to transition into working for the Parthenon in Nashville.
Okay. So let's see. The full story is I was very fortunate to travel with my family to Greece when I was about 13 years old. And I just thought it was amazing what we saw. And that stuck with me, right? So when you're young, if you are lucky enough to travel, that can make an impression. I went to college with the idea, wanted to learn more. I loved history and art history. I knew that. History, art history, archaeology. I went to a college where they had wonderful teachers and an archaeology major, and I was able to study a lot of ancient Mediterranean archaeology and art history. And that was my major. And I thought, well, maybe what I really want to do is work in a museum. So I worked in a museum for a little while. And then I thought, well, maybe what I really want to do is be a teacher. And really the best way to teach archaeology and art history is to go to graduate school. So then I was in graduate school for a very long time. And I learned to teach college classes. But I was also moving around, starting a family. And so my career ended up in a kind of zigzag, where I have in one way or another done different kinds of teaching, whether it's through museums, libraries, in community spaces. And, you know, I respect those of you who are in the classroom with a real teaching credential, because I think so much of the time we're learning by teaching, you know, and we try something and kids respond to it, so then we keep doing it. In what's different in a museum is we're really engaging people informally. And we have a tremendous number of visitors who really enjoy approaching our art cart and just having one-on-one conversations. And sometimes people just want to know a little bit of information. So we try not to overload people with too much information. And we try to activate the learning with different activities and hands-on learning. And that's what I think we can do in a museum space. So that's kind of some of the different experiences I bring to the role. When you're in a field like this, you have to be prepared to take on different kinds of a mixture of volunteer and paid assignments. And sometimes it's just a question of being opportunistic and just taking opportunities that are in front of you and knowing that you're always building skills that can be used in different ways. So I can't ever recommend that anyone follow my zigzag unconventional career, but I can offer, you know, encouragement to young people who are interested in archaeology and art history, that if you're really interested, and you give it a try and you're prepared to work hard, there are opportunities and possibilities. You just don't know what they will be.
Well, thank you so very much, Miss Helen. I know we've got all of our comments coming in, and I know that the excitement is definitely mounting as several of us will be coming to Nashville this weekend, and you have definitely pumped the primer for our learning immersion this weekend. So we are so thankful. And I know that you brought lots of great learning to us. I know I'm looking at some of the comments that they were like, you know, this session was great and that we've already learned so much. And it definitely is going to pique our interest once we get there. And you know, this front loading was exactly what we needed. So thank you so much for sharing this knowledge with us. We definitely appreciate you taking your time and look forward to getting some virtual field trip sessions from this group. So I think they're definitely excited about that as well.
Absolutely. I hope this is the first of many conversations with some of you as we help support a lot of different kinds of teaching and creativity. Thank you for listening. Thank you for inviting me to join.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a great evening.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Helen.
All right. Well, if you all need anything, remember this is your last week to kind of complete newsletters for this this invoice like I don't know what I'm trying to say. This last invoice. I'm like, what day is it? Get your newsletter submissions in. If you want to complete your book study and go ahead and get it turned in. Several of you I know have sent me emails asking if there's a form that you have to submit. No, just get your assignments in. That's all we need you to do is just get those assignments in. So newsletter, book study, anything else that were burning questions before you submit your newsletter or your invoices before March 3rd. Anything else? You all good?
Do we put the Nashville trip on this invoice
You
too?
will get a new invoice. Gabby will have an invoice
That's
in her
right, okay.
hand, and she will, anybody that shows up, you will get an invoice from Gabby in your hand, so you don't have to worry about putting it on there. You get a completely different invoice. So those of you that are going on the, you know how Gabby is, she's got to see you and you got to sign it, and you know, she don't trust you saying I'm coming. She wants to see you in person. So all right. Well, if you all need anything, send us an email. But we've got a couple other really great sessions this week. Otherwise, I will see you all in Nashville. Have a great week.
Hey, Wendy, I do have a question really quick.
Yes, absolutely.
So what time are we going to be finished with our tour on Saturday?
On